The ghost town of Silverbrook held its breath as Catherine Sullivan stepped down from the dusty stagecoach, her dark riding skirt clinging to curves that could make a saint reconsider his vows. At 38, she moved with the grace of a woman who'd learned that survival meant never showing weakness, even when your heart was hammering against your ribs like a caged bird. 24-year-old Jake Morrison watched from the shadows of the abandoned general store, his calloused hands gripping the reins of his horse. He'd come to this godforsaken place to sell his father's legacy, 500 acres of Texas drought-ravaged ranch land. What he hadn't expected was to see the most beautiful woman he'd ever laid eyes on walking straight into what looked like trouble. Because trouble was exactly what those 5 riders approaching from the east represented. Blackjack Garrison and his gang, their guns glinting in the dying light, like promises of violence. And the way they were looking at the widow Sullivan, well, Jake had been raised to believe that a decent man never let a lady face danger alone. Even if he'd never been this close to a woman who made his pulse race and his mouth go dry. What happens when an inexperienced cowboy meets a woman who could teach him everything about desire and danger? Stay with us to discover how far a man will go for honor and love. Jake Morrison had always believed that a man was measured by the weight of his word and the value of his land. That's what his father had taught him during those long Texas nights, when the coyotes howled and the stars seemed close enough to pluck from the sky. But as he watched Catherine Sullivan smooth her hands down her riding jacket, the movement drawing attention to a waist he could probably span with his hands, Jake realized there were some lessons his father had never shared. "Ma'am," he said, stepping out from the shadows, his voice rougher than he intended. "This might not be the safest place for a lady to be traveling alone." Kate turned, and Jake felt like he'd been kicked by his own horse. Her eyes were the color of whiskey in firelight, and when she smiled, Lord Almighty, it was the kind of smile that could make a man forget his own name. "And you would be?" she asked, tilting her head just enough to show the elegant line of her throat. "Jake Morrison, ma'am, from Texas." He touched the brim of his hat, trying to remember how to breathe normally. "And you'd be Mrs. Sullivan, I'm guessing." Her eyebrows rose. "My reputation precedes me." "Your beauty does, ma'am," Jake said, then immediately felt heat climb up his neck. Sweet Jesus. Had he actually said that out loud? But Kate's laugh was like silver bells in a summer breeze. "Mr. Morrison, I do believe you're blushing." She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender in her hair, the warmth of her skin. "When was the last time you talked to a woman who wasn't your mother?" Before Jake could answer, and probably make an even bigger fool of himself, the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the evening air, like a knife through silk. 5 riders emerged from the desert haze, their faces hard as the badlands that had shaped them. Blackjack Garrison sat his horse like a king, surveying his domain, his cold eyes fixed on Kate with the intensity of a predator sizing up prey. "Well, well, Mrs. Catherine Sullivan. Thought you'd learned your lesson after what happened to your dear departed husband." Jake felt every muscle in his body coil like a spring. He'd heard stories about the Garrison gang, about the mines they'd acquired, and the people who'd gotten in their way. Looking at Kate now, the way her jaw tightened, the way her hands clenched into fists, he realized those stories were likely just the beginning. "I told you before, Garrison," Kate said, her voice steady as bedrock, despite the tremor Jake caught in her breathing. "The Sullivan mine isn't for sale." "Everything's for sale, sweetheart. Just depends on the price." Blackjack's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "And sometimes that price gets paid in blood." That's when Jake stepped between them, his hand resting easy on the grip of his Colt. It wasn't bravado. His father had taught him to shoot before he could properly ride, and he'd never missed what he aimed at. But he'd also never drawn on another man, never felt the weight of potential violence hanging in the air like smoke. The lady said, "No," Jake said quietly. "Seems to me that should be the end of it." Blackjack's laugh was uglier than a buzzard's cry. "Boy, you don't even know what game you're stepping into. This is business between adults." "Then maybe you should start acting like one," Jake replied, and felt Kate's sharp intake of breath beside him. The first shot shattered the evening silence like breaking glass. Jake grabbed Kate's hand and pulled her toward the old saloon, his heart hammering as bullets whistled past their heads. Her fingers were slender but strong in his, and he could feel the trembling she was trying so hard to hide. "In here." He shouldered through the batwing doors, pulling her into the dusty shadows of what had once been Silverbrook's social heart. Broken chairs and overturned tables provided cover, but not much. Kate pressed her back against the bar, her chest rising and falling in a way that made Jake's mouth go dry despite their circumstances. "You didn't have to—" "Yes, I did." Jake checked his ammunition, his movements quick and sure. "My father taught me that a man who won't stand up for what's right isn't much of a man at all." "And what makes you think I'm worth standing up for?" The question came out softer than she'd probably intended, vulnerable in a way that made something twist in Jake's chest. He looked at her then, really looked, at the way the dying light caught the gold threads in her dark hair, at the proud set of her shoulders, at lips that were full and soft and made him think of things a gentleman shouldn't. "Because you're here, aren't you? Because you could have sold out, taken their money, and lived safe somewhere else. But you didn't." Something shifted in her expression, something that made the air between them feel charged like the moments before a lightning storm. "You don't know me, Mr. Morrison." "Maybe not," Jake said, moving closer despite every instinct telling him to keep his distance. "But I know courage when I see it, and I know beauty when it takes my breath away." The gang had them surrounded now, their voices carrying through the broken windows as they discussed how best to smoke them out. Jake positioned himself at the front window, his rifle ready, while Kate took the side. That's when he noticed the small derringer in her hand, held with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. "You're full of surprises, Mrs. Sullivan." "A woman in my position learns to take care of herself," she said, then glanced at him sideways. "Though I have to admit, it's been a long time since a man stood up for me, just because it was the right thing to do." "Your husband didn't—" "My husband was a good man, but he was also practical. He would have negotiated, tried to find a compromise." Her voice caught slightly. "That's what got him killed." Jake felt anger rise in his chest, hot and clean. They killed him. Made it look like an accident, a cave-in at the mine. Kate's knuckles were white where she gripped her gun. But Thomas was careful, always careful. He wouldn't have been in that tunnel if someone hadn't forced him. Before Jake could respond, Blackjack's voice boomed across the street. "You've got 1 minute to send out the widow, boy. This doesn't have to be your fight." Jake met Kate's eyes in the gathering darkness. They were the color of autumn storms now, fierce and beautiful and afraid. Without thinking, he reached out and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "It became my fight the moment I saw you," he said quietly. Kate leaned into his touch for just a moment, her eyes fluttering closed. When she opened them again, Jake saw something there that made his blood sing. Want, pure and simple, mixed with a gratitude that went deeper than words. "Jake," she whispered, and hearing his name on her lips was like a prayer and a curse all rolled into one. He might have kissed her then. God knows he wanted to. But the crash of splintering wood, announced that their time was up. Blackjack and two of his men burst through the back door, while the others kept watch outside. What followed was chaos, gunfire, and shouting, and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Jake's training took over, muscle memory guiding his movements as he rolled behind the overturned poker table and returned fire. His first shot took down one of the gang members. His second sent Blackjack diving for cover. But it was Kate who surprised them all. While the men were focused on Jake, she slipped around the bar and put her derringer against the third man's neck. "Drop your weapons," she said, her voice steady as stone, "or I paint the wall with his brains." Blackjack's face twisted with rage. "You think you've won something here? The mine's worthless anyway. Played out. Nothing left but holes in the ground." "Then why do you want it so badly?" Kate asked, not moving the gun an inch. "Because it's the principle of the thing. You can't just—" Jake's rifle shot cut him off, the bullet taking Blackjack high in the shoulder and spinning him around. The gang leader went down hard, his own gun clattering across the floor. "Principle," Jake said, levering another round into the chamber. Funny thing about principles, they tend to look different depending on which end of the gun you're on. The remaining gang members threw down their weapons, hands raised. It was over, but Jake knew the real test was just beginning. In the quiet that followed, with the gang members trussed up like calves at branding time, Kate finally lowered her derringer. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline of the fight leaving her system. "I can't go back to the way things were," she said quietly, staring at the gun in her hands. "Always looking over my shoulder. Always afraid." Jake holstered his Colt and moved to stand beside her. This close, he could see the pulse beating in her throat, could feel the heat radiating from her skin. "So don't." She looked up at him, and Jake saw his own need reflected in her eyes, the hunger for something real, something clean and honest in a world that seemed determined to grind the hope out of decent people. "I could buy your ranch," she said suddenly. "Pay off your debts, give you a fresh start. We could rebuild this place, make it live again." Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. "Kate, I know it's crazy. I know you barely know me, and I barely know you, but—" She stopped, biting her lower lip in a way that made Jake's mouth go dry. "But I haven't felt this alive in years. And life's too short to let fear make all our decisions." Jake reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he cupped her face in his hands, marveling at the softness of her skin, the way she leaned into his touch like a flower, turning toward the sun. "My father always said a man's land was his legacy," Jake said quietly. "But maybe some legacies are worth more than others." When he kissed her, it was soft at first, gentle, questioning. But Kate's response was like touching a match to kindling. Her arms went around his neck, her body pressing against his, in a way that made every nerve ending sing. She tasted like whiskey, wildness, like promises and possibilities. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "So what happens now?" Kate's smile was pure sunshine, breaking through storm clouds. "Now, we build something together, something worth fighting for." 6 months later, Silverbrook was alive again. The sound of hammers and saws echoed through the streets as new buildings rose from the ashes of the old. The Sullivan mine, it turned out, still had silver in her veins, enough to fund a new beginning for a town that had given up hope. Jake Morrison stood on the porch of the house he'd built with his own hands, watching his wife hang laundry in the morning sun. Kate moved with the same grace that had stolen his breath that first day, but there was something new in her bearing now, a contentment, a sense of belonging that made her beauty shine even brighter. She caught him watching and smiled, that same smile that could make him forget his own name. See something you like, Mr. Morrison? Every day of my life, Mrs. Morrison, Jake replied, stepping down to help her with the washing. Every single day. Sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a single moment of courage. If this story moved you, hit that like button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales of love, danger, and redemption from the American frontier. Because every heart has a story worth telling.